Hi students, in this video I'll cover the chapter 3 of your Sec 4 history syllabus, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, in chapter 1 we learn about how the Cold War started. Chapter 2 we learn about how the Korean War was a result of the Cold War. And now in this chapter we're going to look at another event that is 10 years after the Korean War in Cuba, and how that is, you can see as a continuity of the Cold War. Okay, how US and their allies and the USSR continue to have a lot of tension. Okay, so this is a rather big chapter, so I'm going to divide the chapter into 3 big parts. Okay, point 1, point 2, and 3.3. So the first part, we're going to explore what is the tension, why was there a lot of tension between America and Cuba. Number 2, we look at how, more specifically, how the crisis happened, what caused the crisis to happen. And number 3, we focus more on the impact, who was the victor in the Cuban Missile Crisis, as well as how the crisis was resolved. Okay, if you want to look at specific parts of the video, you can refer to the timestamp in the video description. Feel free to jump to the parts that you want to revise on. Okay, so for the first part, okay, let's find a bit more about America and Cuba first. So you know that at 1960, Cold War is going on in Europe. There's the Berlin blockade, there's Korean War, and on the other side of Earth, we have the Cuba. Okay, and this is a very significant event that we included because it was the closest the world came to become it was the closest the world came to engaging in the nuclear war. Okay, even in Korean War, there was no nuclear weapons used. It was conventional weapon, normal troops. Okay, so this is a bit special. Okay, so there's a long history between America and Cuba. Okay, and we're going to explore a little bit what was the history and why America is so concerned with Cuba. Okay, so Cuba, you can see according to the map, is just at the southern tip of America. So it's America's neighbors basically. So this will have a significance into creating tension. Okay, if you are the US, you'll be very interested to find out what happened to your neighbor and what is your neighbor up to. Is your neighboring country a friendly country, or is your neighboring country potentially up to no good? Okay, so that is something you want to be interested in. Okay, and Cuba, a few things you need to know. Okay, it's mainly famous for its agricultural products, okay, like cigars, and this bag is a sugar. Okay, and this one later you will see the US is very interested in these 2 things, and when the US later start to lose access to these things, it created a lot of tension, okay, and a few sports and so on. Okay, so now this is the first part. We're going to explore how come there was so much tension between America and Cuba. Okay, and we're going to look at 3 sort of different time periods. Okay, so if you look at number 1 here, this is like the earliest. Okay, how did America and Cuba, what are their relationship at the earlier stages? And then after, we're going to look at up to 1959. In the 1950s, okay, what was the relationship like? And when we look at the last part, we are mainly looking at maybe around the 1960s, where it was very close to the crisis period. What were some of the things that America, Cuba, as well as USSR did to create a lot of tension? So this one, you can think of it as different time periods. If there's an essay that asks you what caused the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe you can take one factor from number 1 and take one factor from number 3. Talk about different time periods so your answer wouldn't overlap so much and sound the same. Okay, we want to look for different points sometimes. Okay, so I'll cover each of the point one by one. Okay, so feel free to take a break if you want to, because this will be a long video. Okay, so Cuba is very significant to US just now, like I said, because it is very close to America, and America was very involved in the economy in Cuba. Okay, for example, just now I showed that the cigar and the sugar, okay, they were very high demand in the US and Europe. So the US is very interested in the Cuban products, okay, like sugar. Okay, and it was also very near. Okay, so it has strategic value. If Cuba becomes a very volatile or a very state that is hostile towards you, you'll be very concerned being the neighbor. It's like if Malaysia becomes a little bit hostile towards Singapore, Singapore will be very concerned because we are neighbors. If they want to do anything funny, do anything to us, they can do it quite easily. Okay, in the case of Cuba, later you see it involved a lot of military threats. Okay, so Cuba is very near to the US. Okay, and for the US, it was considered very vital to its security. What happens in Cuba is very important for its security. If Cuba becomes an enemy, they can maybe attack the US very easily. So the US wanted Cuba to remain within its sphere of influence. That means the US wants to control Cuba, or at least control what is happening in Cuba, to make sure that whatever Cuba does is not against the interests of the US. Okay, and a long time ago, even in the 1823, there was this US president called Monroe, created this Monroe Doctrine. All right, basically states that, you know, in America, I want to protect all the territories in America, including Cuba. That means Cuba was considered part of the continent of America. They did not want Europe to get near it. So basically, US wants to keep Cuba close. Keep Cuba close to the US and make sure Cuba will remain an ally compared to the rest of the world. So this was very long ago. But as we go towards present time, same thing. From 1800s, they want to keep Cuba close to the US. Okay, and especially later, they want to keep Cuba away from the US enemies like the Soviet Union. Okay, so how did America keep Cuba very close? One thing you can remember is they invested a lot of money into Cuba. Basically, you think of it, they gave money to Cuban businesses, or they created a lot of businesses in Cuba by providing money, lending people money to create businesses. So in America, why are they so concerned with Cuba? Because they managed to monopolize and control the sugar industry. Okay, that means a lot of the sugar, a lot of the tobacco, the cigars, okay, were created by American businesses. American businesses were able to use it to make a lot of money. That means Cuba sold it to America. America was able to sell it to maybe the rest of the world and make a lot of money. Okay, and this phrase about dominated by US capital, what does that mean? It basically means a lot of Cuban businesses were owned or controlled by the US. Okay, they were owned by the USA businessmen, maybe even the US government has an interest in some of the Cuban businesses. So you can think of it, a lot of resources, a lot of money in Cuba is flowing out to the US. Okay, so America always will want to protect its businesses in Cuba, okay, and they do not want whatever happened in Cuba to affect their business interests. Okay, so that is the main thing you want to know. America wants to protect its business in Cuba. Okay, and later on, Cuba will undergo some changes that threaten these businesses. Okay, so the second reason that caused a lot of tensions between America and Cuba is because of the events called the Cuban Revolution. There was this big revolution going on, and it created a lot of tension. It made the relationship between the US and the Cuba much worse, largely because of this revolution and because of this guy called Fidel Castro. Okay, so let's explore this ABCD together. Okay, so just now I said America want to keep Cuba as its ally, want to keep it under its control. So one of the way to do it is to intervene in Cuban politics. That means basically they want the US to choose Cuban leader. Whoever is in charge of Cuba, the US want to make sure that this leader is either chosen by the US or heavily influenced by the US. That means the Cuban leader will listen to the US. Okay, they want to make sure whoever is running the country will be a close ally. Okay, so what does this happen? Okay, they will sometimes overthrow, okay, whoever is the president that is no longer of use to the US. If I'm the Cuban president, I go against the US may try to get rid of me. For example, in the past, they have maybe got the generals to overthrow their Cuban presidents before. Okay, and because of that, okay, a lot of people start to have this anti-American sentiments. People in Cuba including maybe people in the middle class or even the existing rulers. Some of them, they may feel like, you know what, it's quite sad, right, to be always under the control of another country, you know. It feels like we are very powerless. So a lot of people start to resent and hate the USA because of that. And the other reason is also because just now we said the US control a lot of businesses, makes a lot of money out of Cuba. So some people also resented the US for that. Okay, they want to take back what belongs to them. Okay, the sugar, the cigars, the factories, and all the money you can make with it, they want to maybe take it back from the US. Okay, so one of the examples of American puppet, a ruler that was controlled by America, was this Cuban ruler called Batista. You can roughly remember his name. Maybe you don't need to know Fulgencio. Okay, but he's basically one example can use to show how the America can sometimes have a very strong control over Cuba, because this Batista figure, what I need to know is he has a lot of contacts with American businessmen. That means he's very friendly to American businesses, very friendly to even the American mafia, that means the American gangsters who run a lot of Cuban businesses. So a lot of people see it as basically like some sort of a puppet of the US, or the US dog, okay, always listening to the US and not doing the best for Cuban people. Okay, so because of that, Batista has a lot of enemies. A lot of people didn't like Batista. Okay, but the US love it, so the US tried to keep him there. Okay, so the Batista also have to use a lot of violence to sometimes get rid of his enemies. And the US continue to support him even though he's a dictator, because Batista was very close to the US. Batista was very pro-US, and more importantly, Batista was very proud to be anti-communist. And you must remember at that time, US, after World War II, there's no fascism, there's no Nazis. The main enemy the US have were the communists. So if you have one guy that is very anti-communist, it basically means he's your very close friend. Okay, so a lot of people resented, okay, the Americans resented Batista, and eventually they cannot take it anymore. They started what we call the Cuban Revolution. A revolution, in case you forgot what it means to kind of overthrow the government. We have learned about the October Revolution that led to the rise of the Soviet Union in Russia. They overthrew the Tsar, their emperor, and set up a new Soviet state. Okay, so this is another revolution that was created, and it overthrew Batista, and the new leader that came was Castro. Okay, this guy here. So Castro, okay, he understands that people are very sick and tired of Cuba being always under the control of the US, the businesses always controlling Cuban businesses. So he started this revolution, okay, to try and create a new Cuba, okay, and he finally succeeded in overthrowing the Cuban government and became basically the dictator of Cuba. Okay, now Cuba and Castro, initially the US, you know, they wanted to try and say, okay, maybe we can make this Castro guy our new ally. But this Castro, he was, remember, rising up against Batista. He did not like American influence a lot. Okay, so eventually it created a lot of problems between Castro and the US. Okay, although Castro, to make things worse, although Castro was not a communist, he did not call himself a communist, but there were a lot of his ideas, okay, that will appear to look like communists. Okay, later we'll see some of the things that he did that appeared identical to communism, and it made the US very suspicious of this guy. Okay, so how else did Castro and his revolution worsen the tension with the US? Okay, so first thing Castro did was he wanted to take back the Cuban businesses. Initially, Cuba was very dependent on America. US will have to buy the sugar that Cuba produced, and Cuba get to earn a little bit money from that. But because it was America only, America did not pay a lot of good money for Cuban sugar, for Cuban products, because Cuba was so reliant on America, so they can buy it at a very low price. So in order to make sure that, you know, I can sell at a better price, Castro realized he needs to reduce Cuba's reliance on the USA. You know, if the USA are not paying good money for my Cuban sugar, for my Cuban tobacco, I want to make sure I can sell it to other countries that can pay me better. Okay, so what he did was he tried to visit many other countries to seek new markets. To seek new markets, you can think of it as you want to find new buyers for Cuban sugar. They will pay Cuban a fair price. Because you think about it, when America bought all this Cuban sugar, they get to sell it some to the rest of the world. So actually, instead of selling it through America and let America keep some of the money, why not I try and sell it directly to the rest of the world? So that is what basically Castro is trying to do, to bypass America. Make sure America, I don't need America anymore. Okay, and to make things worse, created a lot of tension. One of the country that was very interested in buying things from Cuba was none other than the Soviet Union, the US enemy. Okay, so when Khrushchev, the leader in the Soviet Union, then expressed interest, saying, I want to buy your sugar. Okay, to America, this is a slap in the face. First you don't want to sell to America now you want to sell it to our enemy. Okay, and this will create a lot of tension because they will start to think that Castro is getting closer towards Soviet Union. Castro didn't care about the US. Castro is purposely doing this against the US. It will worsen the relationship between these two countries. Okay, so one of the things that the Soviet Union offered was this, you give me sugar, I can give you Russian oil. One thing you need to know is Cuba used to have sugar and tobacco, but it doesn't have a lot of raw materials like oil. So Cuba was quite dependent on the US for oil. But now that Cuba has kind of an awkward and bad relationship with the US, with the USA, right? They might not get such a good supply of oil. So the USSR come in and say, hey, you are my new friend now. Okay, now that you're selling me sugar, allow me to give you some oil or sell you some oil that you need to run your factories, run your military. Okay, so because of that, the USA starts to think that Cuba's government was very pro-communist. Okay, and because of that, it created a lot of tension. They start to think that Cuba is an ally of the USSR, and because he's an ally to my enemy, Cuba is also now my enemy. Okay, to the US. Okay, so the US was very unhappy, like I said, because US investors' revenue was affected. You don't want to sell to me now. The Cuba later, you will see, even take back some of the US factories, confiscated a lot of the US factories, as well as the money that they could have made. Okay, so it would create a lot of tension. Okay, so one of the, just now, like I said, they took away a lot of American businesses. America used to own a lot of farmland, a lot of the sugar plantation in Cuba. But because under Castro, he created this thing called a land reform law, it basically returned the land to the government. What does this mean? It means that, a lot of the US businesses land were confiscated basically, because they used to own a lot of this plantation to grow sugar, to grow tobacco. Suddenly they say everything belongs to the Cuban government now for me to, do my own production. Okay, and they created these things called a commune. Commune is basically, you can think of it, we learned in the USS under Stalin. It's basically like a big government plantation, or farm, if you will. Okay, so basically everything is going to be run by the government. And this idea looks very familiar, maybe to some of you. It is basically like a version of collectivization, which was what was Stalin's policies, okay, in the USSR. Okay, so this whole thing start to look like communism slowly. Everything owned by the government. People cannot own a lot of private property. So to the US, Cuba is starting to look like communist day by day. Okay, and Castro wanted to do it to solve inequality. Basically, what communists wanted to do also, to take away wealth and redistribute. Okay, so all this made Americans very angry because they feel that, you are threatening my interests. America felt threatened. American businesses felt threatened. Okay, and it will worsen the relationship a lot. Okay, Castro started to look communist, like I said. Okay, now besides Cuba and US, a country, Castro himself also has a very close relationship to Khrushchev. Okay, so there's this story when Castro visited the US not US. I visited the New York. Okay, he also met with Khrushchev. He stayed in a place, you know, in Harlem. Okay, and in this place, Harlem, he met, okay, Khrushchev. Castro and Khrushchev met. Okay, and you can see from this photo, they seem pretty happy and they seem pretty pleased to see each other. And you know, the worldwide media saw this. It starts to look like, you know, Castro is close to Khrushchev. Okay, and because of that, the US will also start to think, is this guy an enemy to the US? Okay, because he's meeting with my enemy country, the leader of the enemy country, and he seems to appear so close. Okay, first he acted like communist, and now he meets the leader of the communists. Okay, so it created a lot of tension between Cuba and America. Okay, America felt insulted and provoked. Okay, so because of that, okay, the tensions worsened. Okay, America were very displeased. Okay, same factor, I don't need to repeat. Okay, now we're going to look at the more recent time period, maybe closer to the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe in the 1960s. Now that Cuba was starting to appear very close to the USSR, how did the relationship become even worse? How did it become even worse? Okay, and because of what Cuba did just now, America will have certain reaction, and the reaction will worsen the relationship even more. If I can give an analogy, if you find out if US is a boyfriend and Cuba is the girlfriend, you realize that Cuba, the girlfriend, is starting to meet another guy. Okay, you used to have a very bad relationship already. Now that you know that Cuba is cheating on you, you will have an even worse relationship, and you'll do things that will make the relationship even worse. Okay, so let's find out what did the US did to Cuba. Okay, because Cuba was starting to get close to the US, starting to become, you know, like an enemy of the US, right? The US wanted to make sure they punish Cuba, to teach them a lesson. So they did this thing called embargo. Embargo is another word for a trade ban. That means they decided, you know, I'm not going to buy some Cuban things. I'm not going to sell to Cuba some things. Okay, so what was this embargo? Okay, so first you must remember, okay, US felt very threatened, okay, decided to punish Cuba, trying to, you know, sell things to and buy things with other countries instead of America. Okay, it used to be one-to-one, you know, you buy and sell things with me. Now you want to find other countries. So the US decided to take revenge. Okay, they decided, you know, to do things like, you know, I'm not going to buy so much sugar from you. So this is one example you can use. They stopped buying so much sugar from Cuba. So cut from 3 million tons to 700,000 tons. What does this mean? It means less profit for Cuba, of course. Okay, because Cuba now got less customers. Okay, the thing about oil is also quite similar. There was oil, you know, that need to be processed before it can be used. The US refused to do that to help Cuba. Okay, so Cuba, they were all nationalized. Nationalized means, just now, like I said, all belongs to the country now. Okay, so how did the US react to that? There used to be a lot of American businesses, but now they are all taken away by the Cuban government. Okay, so they were very alarmed by it. Okay, because of that, they did the embargo, which was a ban on all American exports. That means Cuba will no longer be able to buy many American goods, except, you know, some food and medicine. So if America, you know, make cars, for example, Cuba can no longer buy cars from America. If America make clothes, Cuba can no longer buy clothes from America. So this, you can imagine, will have a very big impact on Cuba, because for a long time, Cuba was reliant on America for resources. Okay, so of course, this will worsen the relationship between the two countries. Okay, however, it was a bit unsuccessful because, like I said just now, Cuba was starting to be less reliant on America. China, the Soviet Union were able to supply the new things that Cuba need. Okay, and it will go a lot. It resulted in the failure of the embargo, basically. All right. So the embargo was not very effective. Okay. But it still created a lot of tension because it made things unnecessarily difficult for the Cuban side. Okay, so there was a lot of economic pressure and it strained relationships between the two countries. Okay, then it's okay. So the last thing that another thing that the US did, not last thing, okay, was US wanted to get rid of Castro directly. They say, you know, if I cannot pressure you using money, using trade, I will try and get rid of you directly. So there's this very infamous Bay of Pigs invasion. Bay of Pigs is basically a place in Cuba. Okay, so they wanted to send in some like you can think of it as a special forces to try and get rid of Castro. Okay, initially the president, okay, wanted to send some troops inside. Okay, the diplomatic relationship, the relationship is very poor by now, and the US did not want to recognize Cuba government. Okay, so what the US did was they prepared fighters, and these fighters used to belong from Cuba. Maybe they left the country because they did not like Castro. So they trained all these fighters and wanted to send all these fighters back in to take over the country. Okay, so they tried to attack, but eventually they failed and they did not have a lot of control over the exiled Cuban fighters. And all you need to know is the attempt by the US to overthrow Castro and his government was a failure. It was a disaster, and many of the fighters that were sent by the US were captured or killed. Okay, and the US eventually, some of them have to pay the Cuba money and goods to try and get back some of their fighters. Okay, so it was a disaster. But imagine a country send fighters to try and get rid of you. How will you feel? How will Castro feel if the US try to send fighters, send troops to overthrow you and try to get rid of you? So obviously this will worsen the relationship between the two countries because you feel threatened by the US efforts. Okay, the US also did not like it because they felt very upset because they thought it will be an easy win, and the US later will try again, this time with another operation. Let me just skip the diagram. They created another operation now called Operation Mongoose. They wanted to try again to get rid of Castro. This time they're going to send CIA assassins to try and assassinate Castro, maybe using poison and using guns and so on. Okay, but this time Mongoose was also a failure. Okay, they did not succeed in assassinating Castro, and this has the effect of pushing Castro even closer to Khrushchev, to the USSR, because now it created a lot of tension. Okay, the relationship between US and Cuba is now really broken because you are really trying to kill me now. Okay, you are not declaring a war, but you're sending in these assassins to make so much trouble and threaten me directly. So Castro will now want to be closer to Khrushchev, which is the US enemy. Okay, so eventually it will result in a formal alliance, okay, between USSR and Cuba. Okay. Okay, let me just skip this. Okay, so eventually they form a formal alliance, and Cuba also at this point, they are not so shy about appearing to adopt communist policies like collectivization, like putting all the industries under the government. Okay, so at this time Cuba really start to look very communist and officially becomes part of the Cold War. Okay, and the US will obviously be very threatened because imagine you have a communist country right at your doorstep. Okay, so these are the factors. Okay, from a very long time ago, US cared about Cuba, to the 1950s where there was the revolution and the new leader Castro started to become a threat to the US, and as well as the actions the US took to try and punish Cuba only pushed Cuba away from the US embrace. Okay, now they are much more closer to the US enemy, which is the Soviet Union. So all this created a lot of tensions. All right. Okay, now we move on to the second part of the chapter, which is how did the missile crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis happen? We talk about how there was a lot of tension between the two countries, but how did we get close to starting a nuclear war in that part of the world? Okay, and how did the Soviet Union got involved also? Okay, so when the alliance between Cuba was set up, okay, with Soviet Union, there was a thought like, Cuba is now my ally, I need to protect my ally. And one of the ways to protect Cuba is to install nuclear missiles in Cuba, because nuclear missiles is a very good deterrence. If I attack Cuba, Cuba may launch missiles back. So because I'm scared, I will not attack Cuba. So that's basically how nuclear weapons work. I threaten to use it against you, so you don't try and attack me. Okay, that's why countries like North Korea today are all trying so hard to have their own nuclear weapons, because it's a very good, bargaining chip, right? So Khrushchev wanted to install nuclear missiles, and the Soviets start to bring things and set up the things needed to set up the missiles, to build the missile bases and so on. Okay, so why did Khrushchev want to install in Cuba? Okay, so first thing is a bargaining chip. Okay, remember the US and the communists, they were having a lot of tension in Europe, in Germany. Okay, so the US wanted, by having Cuba being so close on my side, having missiles, maybe I can use that to threaten you, and I can use that to get some things out of you. Okay, maybe I can ask for more territories in Europe, okay, in return for not bombing you from Cuba. Okay, and Khrushchev also prestige, okay, by being able to threaten the US, Khrushchev will look very powerful. The USSR will look very powerful, okay, and look like the leader of the communist world. Because at that time, Mao Zedong in China was starting to appear like a leader and starting to not listen to Khrushchev very much. So Khrushchev may want to use the chance to show them like, I am still the big boss of communism. Okay, and military gains, of course, if the US ever wants to go to war with the Soviet Union, you want to be able to strike back. And where is better than to have a base at Cuba to strike back easily at the USA? Because remember, Cuba was so close to the US. If I have a base in Cuba, I can attack America very easily, and that will be very useful to the USSR. Okay, so like I said, from Cuba, you can see it on the map here, Cuba, I can easily launch missiles to many parts of America, including its capital, Washington, D.C., including to its economic hub, New York City. Okay, so it was very advantageous, and they can use it as a source of deterrent. So America will not dare to attack USSR because they know Cuba can fire back for USSR very easily. Okay, so it's a deterrence. Now, so why did Castro want the missiles? This one should be also quite obvious, because by placing the missile in Cuba, Castro will also feel more secure and feel more safe, because the missiles can defend Cuba. Okay, and Castro was very afraid because the USA, just now we mentioned the Bay of Pigs invasion, Operation Mongoose, have been trying to overthrow Castro for a very long time. So they have a reason to believe that the US will try again. So by having the Soviet Union involved, by having these nuclear weapons, okay, he will feel a sense of security. Okay, and okay, so the US also knows that Cuba was really starting to become armed with nuclear missiles, because all their photos and all this, you can see they can see things being set up that will allow Cuba to have a missile base. Okay, so these are all the evidence. Okay, even though engineers, they try to disguise it, but eventually, from all the photographic evidence, they are able to analyze that there are really efforts to set up a missile base in Cuba. Okay, although the US may think that the USSR side wants to tell America that it's for defensive purposes, but the missiles, if it's for defensive purpose, you can also use it for offensive purpose, basically. Okay, and they can reach the US, like I said, very easily. So the US clearly will feel very threatened by it. All right. So if there are missiles that start to appear on Cuba, what was the responses by the US. What was the Soviet Union's response to the US action? So let's go and find out a little bit more. So first of all, the US felt that Cuba has aggressive intention. Cuba was a threat to US security. Okay, the missiles are not for show. Okay, and they felt very betrayed, okay, by the USSR also, because although they are enemies, you find it, how can your enemy betray you when they are never your friends to begin with, right? So they obviously, you can think of it as they felt very upset, furthermore upset with the USSR, because now they have already a real threat at their doorstep. Okay, and Kennedy thought, that was because of revenge. Because US at that time, they have missiles in Turkey that could be a threat to the USSR. So Kennedy thought, okay, because I placed all these missiles near the USSR wanted to take revenge and place missiles near the US in Cuba. Okay, and the US thought that the USSR wanted to do a first strike. That means they want to have the ability to hit the USA first. And if they have a missile base right outside the US, there's a very good chance US will be the one to be hit first. And why is the first strike very important? Because you want to be able to destroy the US, bomb the US cities and all its nuclear bases before the US can fire any back. So that's why first strike is very important. And having a base near your target in Cuba is very important. Okay, so for US, they have a few options to respond to the nuclear threat. We'll go through each in turn. Okay, maybe as the president, you can just admit it like, okay, the missiles are there, there's nothing I can do about it. But it will make the US look very weak, and the President Kennedy here will look very uncredible. Okay, the other option is to let's talk it up, let's have diplomacy. Maybe I can convince you to remove these missiles. Okay, but for many people, this is not an acceptable solution because talking takes a long time, and you don't want to appear weak by talking to your enemy. So people thought America will look weak if they try to negotiate with Cuba or negotiate USSR. So this is not a very good option either. Okay, one approach, okay, is to directly ask the Soviet Union to remove the nuclear missiles. But at that point, the relationship with USSR was not good. The relationship with Cuba was very poor. It's not likely going to succeed if they ask the Soviet Union to remove. Why will they? Okay. Number 4, you can try and invade Cuba and destroy the missile bases directly. But there's a threat that if I do that, it's as good as declaring war on Cuba. And remember, when you declare war on Cuba, USSR is the ally. USSR may feel obliged to come in and defend the ally. And that means USA will be basically declaring war with the USSR. And at that time, the Cold War, they wanted to keep it as such. They do not want it to become a real hot war where they fight each other directly. So the US will be very concerned, okay, with such an approach. If I attack Cuba directly, I may end up fighting USSR directly and lead to a global war, which is what they don't want. Another option is, why not I just send a few planes to bomb the nuclear sites? Okay, this was also risky because the USA did not have sufficient intelligence. Basically, this means they do not know where all the nuclear weapons are. They have photos of all the missile sites, but there could be things that they missed out. And this is a very risky strategy. Imagine I have 10 nuclear missiles. The US can bomb 8 of them. There are still 2 that was left that the US did not found. Now that you bomb me, I'll be tempted to retaliate and fire back. And 2 nuclear missiles, I can wipe out 2 US cities. So the US was very afraid of using an airstrike because they are afraid that they will counterattack. Okay. So there's this last option, which is a naval blockade. Naval blockade, you think about it, naval refers to ship. Blockade means to block. So they want to use ships to block Cuba from the rest of the world. So at that time, remember, there were a lot of Soviet ships trying to send materials for the missiles into Cuba. So they said, okay, why not we cut Cuba off from Soviet Union? I form a ring around Cuba using my ships, and I will not allow Soviet Union to send things in. Okay. However, this was also a little bit of risk because in those times when you do a blockade, on a country, you prevent it from getting access to the outside world, is basically considered an act of war as well. And the US may be worried that the Cuba may declare war back on the US, and USSR may declare war on the US also to protect its allies. So there is also an element of risk. Okay, but eventually they decided, okay, let's do the naval blockade. Okay, and brinkmanship. Okay, the US, they decided, you know, brinkmanship means I want to, you know, basically play with fire. I want to make it look like I'm willing to do anything to scare you to back off. So the US also know, you know, we cannot afford to take no risk. You know, we must take risky action and scare the USSR. So one of the action eventually they decided was we'll do a naval blockade. Although it's risky, although it risks getting into a war with USSR, but I want to do it so that, you know, maybe the USSR, they'll back off. They will not want to challenge me. Okay, because remember, the USSR also don't want a war with US. So if the US do something like this, like a naval blockade, maybe the USSR will not counter and respond to it and declare war back. So it's basically a gamble that the US wants to take. Okay, so there was a naval blockade to ensure that no more weapons can get to Cuba, including nuclear weapons. Okay, and they threatened if any Soviet ships, any USSR ships try to get to Cuba, we will search, we will confiscate, we will even threaten to sink if you are not compliant. Okay, so it created a lot of tension. Okay, needless to say, Khrushchev in USSR was very outraged and considered it as an illegal act of war. And the Soviet Union at first insisted that I will ignore it and I will continue to send supplies. Even if you want to attack me, I will break the blockade. Okay, but what happened? Khrushchev, although at first was very outraged, eventually he cooled down, he came down and said, you know what, I don't want to make this crisis even worse. So he immediately recalled a lot of Soviet ships that has departed for Cuba and said, you know, we don't want to challenge the US blockade because we are not ready to confront the USA directly. Okay, but Castro obviously did not care. You know, Castro is ready to go to war because, you know, it's his country, it's his life at stake. Okay, so he was ready to go to war with the US. All right, so that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. It almost led to war, but fortunately, it did not lead to war. Castro was ready to go to war. US and Cuba could have gone to war, but they ultimately took steps that prevented a direct outbreak of war. Okay, fortunately for the rest of the world as well. Okay. Now, let's look at the last part of the chapter, which is the impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Who came out victorious from the Cuban Missile Crisis? Was it the USA that won? Was it the USSR that benefit? Was it Cuba? And how was the crisis eventually resolved? How did they tone it down such that we averted a nuclear war? Okay, so these are the few factors that led to the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can see the first two was the effort by the USSR to try and lower the temperature, to reduce the tension. Okay, and later you will see that there are also other hiccups like the U-2 spy plane incident, which threatened to raise the tension again. And eventually they managed to sign some sort of a deal. We'll go through that in between. Okay, so Khrushchev, okay, was also, okay, very worried that, you know, the US Kennedy, President Kennedy was adopting this policy of brinkmanship. Okay, he did not expect Kennedy to take such risky moves, such as creating a blockade. Okay, but at the same time, okay, Khrushchev also felt very lucky that Kennedy could have done a lot worse. Instead of using ships to surround Cuba, he could have bombed Cuba directly. He could have invaded Cuba directly. And if the US did that, it would be very hard for the USSR to not join and save the Cuban allies. So by just surrounding them, it allows the Khrushchev, you know, to say, okay, I don't need to respond directly. I can find other ways to help Cuba. Okay, so Okay, Khrushchev realized, this is not worth the trouble. Initially, I placed these missiles. I thought it would be very useful, but now it threatens to put the USA and USSR on a collision course to go to war. The whole world may go to nuclear war because of this. So Khrushchev basically thought Cuba is quite troublesome at this point in time. It may not be worth it. Okay, so Khrushchev wrote his first letter of peace. So he basically tells the US president, I will withdraw the missiles in Cuba, but, okay, this is a very important point. US, you must promise me you will not attack my ally, you will not attack Cuba. Okay, so that was the first letter. Okay, now at first the US was like, oh, here's our chance. Maybe we can use this chance to get rid of the missiles in Cuba. Okay, but while they were thinking about it, Khrushchev changed his mind. He said, no. Not attacking Cuba is not good enough. We want more. So they took a harder stance. Khrushchev basically wants the US, okay, to have more demand. So basically now they want the US to agree to remove its missiles in Turkey. So just now we said Turkey is a neighboring country to the USSR. The USA have missiles there that could be used to attack the USSR. So Khrushchev said, no. Not attacking Cuba is not enough. I want you to also remove these missiles. If you take away the missiles in Turkey, I will take away the missiles in Cuba. That seems fair. So that was the second letter to try and negotiate an end to the crisis. Okay. So eventually they were thinking about it. Okay. And while they were thinking about it, okay, something worse happened. The U-2 spy plane incident happened. What was this incident about? It basically, in a nutshell, there was a Soviet commander in Cuba. They accidentally shot down an American spy plane. Remember just now I showed you all those photos of the nuclear missile sites to spy on the missile site. Those were taken from spy planes. So this spy plane was accidentally shot down. The pilot was captured. It threatened to worsen the tension on the island, on Cuba. Okay, so because of this, the US, they capture your pilot, you must do something about it. You must save your pilot. Are you going to invade the country to save your pilot or what? So there was a lot of pressure on the US to maybe take harsher action. And Kennedy at this point may not be ready to take such harsh action. So that is why he thought, I need to quickly come up with a peaceful agreement to end this crisis. Okay, so in the end, Kennedy, under pressure, decided, okay, I will respond to your demands in your second letter, which is to remove the missiles in Turkey. Okay, so Kennedy agreed to remove the missiles in Turkey once the Cuban Missile Crisis is resolved. Okay, so basically, Khrushchev's second letter worked. Okay, however, Kennedy said, this is very embarrassing. If I tell the whole world that I gave in to Khrushchev's letters, Khrushchev's demands, I will look very bad. So he wanted Khrushchev to promise, like, you will not tell this to the rest of the world. This whole thing has to be kept a secret. Okay, so that at least the US will not look so bad, look so weak, negotiating with the enemy. Okay. In the end, okay, the Castro, however, was very unhappy. Soviet Union and US was trying to come up with some sort of peaceful agreement. Castro was very unhappy because Castro still wanted Khrushchev to be on his side, wanted to threaten the US. If Khrushchev took away the missiles, Cuba may become very vulnerable. Yes, the US will promise not to attack Cuba, but without any real missiles, nuclear missiles to defend you, how safe will you feel about the US? Okay, so Castro wanted to, make a lot of noise and threaten to start the war by himself. Okay, so to prevent the crisis from escalating, Khrushchev quickly also wanted to settle the peaceful agreement with the USA because Castro was getting very tense already. Okay, now, so America will not invade Cuba and Soviet will remove the missiles from Cuba as well. Okay. However, there was this small thing. Okay, there was actually still some leftover nuclear missiles. It's called tactical nuclear missile. Tactical nuclear, you can think of it as small. There were the small nuclear missiles that used to hit specific targets, not to blow up entire cities. Okay, so at first Khrushchev wanted to leave this, to reassure Cuba, like, okay, we are not deserting you directly. You still have these small nuclear missiles that you can use to defend yourself if needed. Okay, and at first it was not part of the negotiation. Okay, at first only the big missiles will be withdrew. Okay, but Castro at this time was very panicky. Khrushchev was taking away the big missiles. Khrushchev and Castro, the relationship start to worsen a little bit because Castro will be wondering, why is Khrushchev negotiating with President Kennedy, with the USA? Okay, and when Castro threatened to review the nuclear missiles left in Cuba, threatened to use them, Khrushchev said, you know what, I don't want to risk it. I'm about to get peace. I will now take away the remaining tactical nuclear missiles from Cuba as well. Okay, to save myself the trouble. Because remember, at that time, Cuba was starting to appear to be a very troublesome territory for the USSR. USSR, although is against the US, but they were not ready to go to war over a country so far away. Okay. So there were a few other factors that led to the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, one is, Kennedy and Khrushchev was willing to cooperate with each other, but other people were also pressuring them to do something about it to reduce the crisis, to reduce the tension. Okay, at first they were both very hardline. They were both not willing to step down. Okay, but in time to come, both men realized that, I need to tone it down a little bit because, going to a nuclear war over this is not worth it. Okay, that is why Kennedy did not initially do an airstrike or invasion of Cuba. They also start to realize that it is not worth fighting over Cuba like this. Okay, so the good thing about naval blockade is you're not attacking anybody, you're just surrounding a country. So it is less provocative. It also gave Khrushchev time, to think about how to respond in a peaceful and calm manner as well. Okay, so both countries, wanted to maintain their public image. So these things makes it a bit complicated. You want to have peace, but you also don't want to appear weak by giving in to the demand so much. Okay, especially for President Kennedy, he needs to fight an election. Okay, he needs to appear strong and tough. Okay, and Khrushchev also, although he's a dictator, but he knows that, there are other people in the Soviet Union that can get rid of him if they really want to. Okay, so both sides, the president and President Kennedy and Khrushchev wants to appear tough. Okay, and they want to end the crisis basically in a mutually beneficial way. They basically want both US and USSR to look good, basically. We don't want to appear weak by giving up so easily. Okay, so how did other people help? Okay, the UN sent people to try and get the two of them to talk. Even the US allies like Britain and its NATO partners also convinced the US, this is not worth fighting. Can we try and resolve the crisis as soon as possible? Okay, all this helped to convince Khrushchev and Kennedy to find a peaceful resolution. Okay. Okay, so eventually, okay, the President Kennedy decided, okay, Khrushchev wanted to negotiate, let's negotiate. They want us to remove the missiles from Turkey, let's remove it, but in exchange, we get rid of Cuban missiles. Okay. And the US, however, did not get 100% of what is won, because remember, initially it was so tough against Cuba because Cuba was starting to be very anti-US. So although Cuba is no longer a threat without the nuclear missiles, but it's still very anti-US. So it's not a 100% victory for the US. And you have to accept that you now have a communist country right at your doorstep. So the USA won some, and the USA also lost some, if you think about it. Okay. For Khrushchev, same thing. You managed to get peace. You managed to get the missiles removed from Turkey. But at the same time, for Khrushchev himself, he appeared very weak in trying to negotiate. There were missiles that were ready to strike the US, and you took it away. You look like you are retreating. You look like you are running away from a fight. So for Khrushchev, his reputation was very affected. Okay, and many people in Russia, in USSR, thought Khrushchev was very weak, very lenient, and eventually Khrushchev was removed from power by his colleagues. Okay, and a large part of it was because of how he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis. He appeared too weak and too willing to negotiate with the USA, which was the enemy at the time. Okay, so for Khrushchev, it was a very big defeat for him personally. Okay, but for the communist countries, okay, they were also saw it as a big defeat because it was a Cold War. You're challenging the US and you withdrew your missiles from Cuba. It's kind of admitting defeat also. Okay, and China from then on will want to rise up and say, you know, USSR, you're a very big, you're a very lousy leader. You cannot lead the communist countries. China will from then on start to want to appear to be the leader of the communist countries, but that is not really in the syllabus, just for you to know. Okay, so the USSR did not really won 100% from this. Okay, Cuba, did they win from this crisis? You can say yes and no. You lost your missiles that USSR gave you, okay, but in return, you are still in power. The USA did not invade you. Today, Cuba is still an independent country, and Castro managed to stay in power and appeared like a hero for standing up against two superpowers. He was able to appear strong in front of the US and also appear strong in front of the USSR. Remember just now when the USSR was taking away the missiles from Cuba, Castro was also trying to stand up against the USSR. So Castro appeared very tough and he won a lot of support for that. Okay. However, the relationship with the USSR from then on became more strained. They are all communist countries, but they were not so close anymore because you can imagine Castro will feel quite betrayed by the USSR. Okay. But you will feel safe from now on. The US promised not to invade, and so far they have kept to their promise. So Cuba did get something out of the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. Okay, some other impact. This one is about a minor point. You know, from then on, USA and USSR started to entertain the possibility. Maybe we want to negotiate more directly. You know, the Cuban Missile Crisis almost created a nuclear war. Let's try and prevent these things from happening. So they decided to create a hotline where the US president can talk to the USSR leader directly to try and calm things down if they need to. Okay, because if you talk, there's always a chance to resolve it. Okay, and they don't want to rely on middlemen who may not pass the message accurately. So they create a direct telephone line to talk to each other. Okay, they also learned from this lesson, nuclear weapons are very dangerous. Maybe we want to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. Both US and USSR thought maybe we reduce together, then we wouldn't have the threat of nuclear weapons. So initially they wanted to do that. Okay, there were this thing called like test ban treaties. Basically, they tell each other, we will not develop so many new nuclear weapons from now on. We want to slow down the growth of nuclear weapons. Okay, so that eventually maybe we can start cutting down the number of nuclear weapons. But unfortunately, after Khrushchev was removed from power, after Kennedy was assassinated for other reasons, okay, there was new leaders in USSR and new leaders in the USA, and both sides wanted to restart their nuclear weapon program. And the world today is still filled with a lot of nuclear weapons, okay, and the threat of a nuclear war still remains to this day. Okay, fortunately today, the world is relatively peaceful, but you know, with what is happening in Russia and so on, which is a nuclear power state, the risk of a nuclear weapon being used will always be there. Okay, so in conclusion, okay, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we want you to learn about it because this is the closest the world ever got to a nuclear war. And not only do we want to understand how it happened, we also want to learn how to resolve such crises, because imagine if in the future there are such crises happen, we want to learn how to prevent it from getting out of hand. Okay, so there are a lot of learning points from the Cuban Missile Crisis, how to prevent a crisis and how to cool down a crisis. Okay, and that is a very important lesson we want to learn from history, and hopefully the world learns something from it and we do not see another nuclear crisis happen again. All right. So that is the end of this very long video. Thank you for listening. If you have watched the whole way, I wish you all the best. And I see you in the next video as we go into the last chapter. All right. Bye-bye.